Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting-edge issues shaping national security and defense. It's Thursday, November 14th, 2024. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Today we'll be speaking with CDA Institute board member Kerry Buck about the implications of a second Trump presidency for the NATO alliance, Canadian security, and for the war in Ukraine. Kerry was Canada's permanent representative and ambassador to NATO, and she's currently a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. This is the Expert Series. Kerry, thanks for joining us today to discuss the implications of the recent U.S. election. Trump's resounding victory, which included the popular vote, surprised many, but was a scenario NATO and Canada had been preparing for. His return raises questions about the future of the alliance and U.S. commitments, and the potential for pressure on Canada's defense spending and military cooperation. Trump's stance on Ukraine might disrupt Western support, and it could potentially weaken the united front against Russian aggression. So it'll be interesting to get your insights, Kerry, on how Canada and NATO might navigate this new reality.
Kerry, thank you so much for joining us. Today we'll be discussing the impact of a second Donald Trump presidency for NATO and for Canadian security. So to begin and frame the discussion, Trump's return to the U.S. presidency could have significant implications for NATO and European security, particularly with his stance on Ukraine's NATO membership, potential withdrawal from key agreements. And for Canada, this raises a lot of very important questions. So with that said, with Trump now returning to office in 2025, what does it mean for NATO and what does it mean for Canada?
Well, the short answer is we don't yet know what it means for NATO. Although President Trump isn't necessarily an ideologue, part of his approach to foreign policy has been to sow uncertainty. There's one thing he's been pretty consistent about, and that's his distrust of NATO, of the alliance. He's been consistent on that since he first floated his first run for presidency way back when. I think that was the late 80s, where he published an op-ed saying that, basically the alliance was not in U.S. interests and that the Europeans were relying too much on the U.S. So what is certain is that he doesn't like NATO. He doesn't necessarily see the full benefit to the U.S., but what he'll do is it's kind of an open question right now. I mean, there are different grades of damage, that there's a spectrum of damage that he could potentially inflict on NATO, ranging from, the worst, which would be to attempt to withdraw from the treaty, which would crumble NATO completely. But there are many steps short of that he could do that would cause pretty significant damage to the alliance. He could hollow it out from within by not putting the people inside the NATO Secretariat that the NATO Secretariat relies on. But more importantly, if he were to significantly downgrade the presence of American troops in Europe, particularly ground troops in Europe, or worse, send a different signal on the U.S. security nuclear umbrella in Europe, then he could cause a significant hollowing out of the alliance. And although it sounds like it's less damaging, even his words have already caused some damage to NATO, I would argue, and could do more. NATO is primarily a political alliance in that deterrence of the Russian threat is largely through a unity of political messaging backed up by the credible threat of military action, for sure. But it's really important that NATO have one common position, for instance, on Russia. And it's clear that Donald Trump doesn't share the position that's been held by NATO since at least 2014, when Russia first hit into Ukraine and took over Crimea. So it's not clear what he's going to do. There's some hints from members of the transition team about what that might look like. And some of the things that I've read, and again, I don't know how true they are to what the actual plans are. One of the proposals was that there be a two-tier NATO, and that if an ally spends 2%, then they're part of the security guarantee, mutual security and defense guarantee. But if they don't, they're not. Well, that drives a Mack truck through the middle of Article 5, which is the piece of the Washington Treaty that says that if one ally gets hit, the alliance will respond. So that, I think, is a very dangerous proposal. Why Canada should care? Well, I think we're already more vulnerable on security writ large, regardless of what President Trump might do to NATO. Some of those vulnerabilities will be exacerbated by U.S. unpredictability during a second Trump presidency. Some of those security vulnerabilities for Canada are already caused by diminishing U.S. leadership in the world writ large. And then some vulnerabilities are there anyway, regardless of what happens with the U.S., because there are new threat vectors where Canada needs more collaboration with other allies, including the U.S., rather than less. Threats that cross borders, misinformation, climate security, Arctic ice melting, etc. But specifically, if there's damage to NATO, there are a number of Canadian security interests and political interests that'll be hit. NATO gives us a table of trained and ready Western troops that are fully interoperable with our own military. They've trained together, they know how to deploy together, their equipment can work together, their planes and tanks can talk to each other. NATO gives legitimacy to international military operations. Canada's used it to diversify our security partnerships. And then beyond military operations, NATO serves, for us anyway, an important political role, right? So when the UN Security Council is unable to act to a grave breach of international peace and security, for instance, because Russia is a permanent member with a veto, then allies can and do turn to NATO to align our policy positions and to speak out and put out public position internationally. So, in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, NATO was fast out of the gate in early condemnation of this, and then the G7 as well. NATO is also a force multiplier for Canada on issues of international security. It's the premier international security table. We've got a voice and a veto there. And that's, that was the original aim when Pearson was first working on the treaty. And then finally, Europe is really important to our own security and our economic prosperity. The EU is our second largest trading partner. And the war in Ukraine's already had an impact on supply chains, worldwide food prices, refugee flows, so political instability and economic instability. So, imagine the economic and security impact on us directly, on Canada directly, if that instability spreads. So it's in our interest to keep NATO going and to keep NATO strong and to keep NATO unity together. And it is not at all clear that we'll be able to achieve that outcome when Donald Trump comes into his second term, or even before, to be honest, his second term in office.
Well, Kerry, that's a really excellent primer. This next question, I'm not sure if you'll be able to weigh in, but as you said, and as we all know, Trump can be a very unpredictable figure. We never quite know if when he's making statements about NATO or alliances, if he's kind of just trying to rally his base or entertain his base. We aren't quite able to take his word at face value all the time. So with that said, what is the likelihood that Trump gets into office perhaps and ends up being surrounded by somewhat competent administrators who still see the value in the United States' relationship with NATO and its alliances, and maybe try to keep him on a certain track and maybe rein in some of his, I suppose, some of the impulses he's articulated?
Well, I saw that up close and personal during the first Trump administration. I was in smaller meetings, NATO meetings, bilaterals with, his Secretary of State and our Foreign Minister, with the Secretary of Defense and our Defense Minister, and at two Trump summits where I saw the team around Trump, including a number of individuals who were I mean, we know from the media, we don't talk about what happens in NATO meetings, so I'm pretty careful here. But I do know from the media, and I know um, from what I saw personally, there were people in his administration who were trying to, put some curbs on the more extremist isolationist tendencies or the more extremist pro-Russian tendencies that President Trump first term exhibited. None of those people that I'm referring to appear to be coming back in the second administration. And those who know Washington better than I, so for instance, David McNaughton, our former ambassador, said publicly as well that he expects people in the second Trump administration to be more about loyalty and less about honest advice, and more ideological, perhaps, than some in the first administration were. So I don't expect as many checks and balances. We'll have to watch carefully the kind of people who are being announced over the next few weeks for the key positions. Um, but once those people get into position, it's very difficult continuing to give honest advice if that advice is not welcome. And we know what President-elect Trump's view is about NATO. He's not bluffing about that. I said his ideas about NATO, his negative views about NATO go as far back as 1987, and he's been fairly consistent. Again, what we don't know is how far he'll want to take that dislike of NATO and how much damage he'll do. But my educated guess is that there will be damage done to NATO.
Well, thanks for that perspective, Kerry. I'd like to focus a bit more and dive a little deeper into how Canada can prepare for such an eventuality. So, from your perspective, how could Canada protect itself and maybe strengthen its standing in the alliance under some of these potential pressures? And additionally, how might we hedge against scenarios where NATO unity falters or where U.S. involvement in the alliance becomes less reliable?
Well, the primary thing to do is to reach the 2%. That commitment was made as early as 2008 in a defense ministers meeting, and then at the Wales summit in 2014, I think. So we have two prime ministers who've committed to reach the 2% goal. Under Stephen Harper, who committed the first time around, there were 4 steady years of cuts to the defense budget. Under Prime Minister Trudeau, the good news is that his government has promised the biggest increase in defense spending that we've seen for generations. The bad news is that the money isn't flowing out enough, but worse, our commitment, our plan to reach the 2% that was announced at the Washington summit last summer was having us reach the 2% as far out as 2032, and it didn't provide detailed plans and costings, and it came out in a manner that was pretty wobbly on the very last day of the summit. A little bit of shooting ourselves in the foot, honestly. It would have been stronger, cleaner, and helped us be less vulnerable if we'd had a clearer plan announced with some vigor and confidence earlier on. But we got the plan, but we have to show that we're real about that plan. We've made ourselves increasingly vulnerable by being increasingly an outlier on defense spending. And we're very vulnerable to Trump, particularly with his language and his threats about not defending those who don't reach 2%. And he's also linked the idea of defense spending with the notion of tariffs. So bad news and bad news. So job number 1 is to get a concrete plan, detailed costing that should be held by either government, Canadian government, whoever is in power, to get us to the 2%. And I would suggest that 2032 is probably a little far out to help us mitigate the risk with Trump. But then second, I think we need to do something that's a little more strategic, a little longer term. I said earlier that our vulnerabilities have shifted, will shift if NATO is damaged. And our vulnerabilities have already shifted because of the changing nature of threats. So I would suggest that it would be really smart for the government to take a review of Canada's strategic approach to NATO to minimize the risk that we will be either isolated or rendered ineffective or NATO will be rendered ineffective for us, for our foreign policy and defense, our security and defense priorities. So a review, that's boring. But the point is that you have to, I think that we should go through almost like a strategic listing of our assets. We have some really important assets that we bring to the table at NATO. They're not just defense assets, they're also diplomatic assets, and a more strategic outline of our vulnerabilities. And then pick out those areas where we're most vulnerable and start to work more closely with those NATO allies so that we diversify our security partnerships. Arctic. I would start with Arctic, right? As of March 2024, all Arctic nations except Russia are members of NATO. So what do we do in the Arctic? Well, I mean, we could just choose to focus on our own Arctic capabilities. Good luck. Our procurement timelines for the Arctic offshore patrol boats aren't great. Coast Guard polar icebreakers even worse. We don't have Arctic capable submarines, although those are apparently coming. So that would be difficult, right? Or we could just look to the US and tie protection of our Arctic to NORAD. I don't think that's smart. I don't think it's smart because with an unpredictable Trump in office in the US, we have a continuing Arctic territorial dispute with the US that Pompeo raised during the first Trump term. So I don't know how much we could rely on, US coming with a shoulder to shoulder, or US, taking more of the heavy lifting in our Arctic. Or we could seek to build an Arctic pillar within NATO. And I won't get deep into it, but the idea is that you'd start to treat the European and North American Arctic as almost contiguous spaces where you'd work with the Arctic nations inside NATO to have a much more cooperative, multi-ally approach to protecting our Arctic. We probably have to do all of those things. So that's what I mean by a more strategic approach to defining our vulnerabilities, figuring out who we need to work with to do a better job of those. And the idea is to diversify our security partnerships so we don't have as much of an over reliance on the US. And then lastly, it's not all about NATO, but we've announced over the past couple of years a lot more contributions to NORAD, but there's still some pretty serious gaps at NORAD that we need to probably fill sooner rather than later. Gaps like over the horizon radar, where the Russian and Chinese and even North Korean missile capabilities, they have those capabilities before we're able to put in place the over horizon radar that can tell us that missiles are coming from those sources.
Well, thanks, Kerry. I agree on your point that it's imperative for Canada to perhaps diversify its alliances or seek out other strategic allies. That said, individuals like Kim Nosel might say that because Canada shares such a long border with the United States, that we might be stuck with the United States. Part of our strategic geography is being stuck with the US and North America. So with that said, to what extent can Canada perhaps realistically hedge against a potentially more isolationist or inward-looking or disruptive US?
We will always rely on the US because of our geography and because of relative imbalance of both economic and security and power, for sure. I can't imagine a future where they're not our primary trading partner, and I can't imagine a future where we're able to protect our own sovereignty militarily on our own. So that isn't going to happen. But the point is, if they're more unpredictable south of the border, if they're a less reliable security partner for us, if they put up more trade barriers, we have to grow up a bit. We have to diversify some of our defense and our trade relationships. It doesn't mean we'll disentangle ourselves from the US. I don't think that's possible, but it's at least a mitigation strategy. So, I talked about how we could diversify some of our security relationships, but there's a broader foreign policy point that I think we have to rebuild or build more strategic sovereignty in our foreign policy writ large. Understand that while we will frequently align ourselves with the US, we have to take a more deliberate approach to deciding where we distance ourselves from US policy. So, for instance, Ukraine, right? There are going to be moves in Europe to try and offset the unpredictability of the US position on Ukraine and to seek to have a more reliable flow of arms and other support to Ukraine in spite of the US. We'll see how far they go because there's the real challenge of magnitude. The US is just bigger in their capacity to provide military support. So is Canada going to go and try and steer some of those processes in Europe, or will we tuck ourselves behind the US and basically give up on Ukraine? I don't think that's in our interest, right?
How might Ukraine and supporters of Ukraine prepare for a scenario involving potential negotiations, which might involve things like territorial compromises or limitations on Ukraine's NATO ambitions? Don't want to assume.
Well, every war ends with negotiations, right? But the key is to strengthen the hand of the side you want to come out victorious, so that in those negotiations, they have more leverage and more capacity to demand conditions of a peace that will be more conducive to a longer term sustainable peace and stability. And unfortunately, Ukraine isn't in that space of strength right now, nor are they losing the battle. But they're not in a position of sufficient strength, I don't think, right now, unless there's a real outpouring of US additional support before Biden leaves office without the caveats about the use of those weapons, plus more European armaments. So President Zelensky really is in a position of strength when the time comes for negotiations. The Russians have never been serious about negotiation. The deal they put on the table before the war broke out, before they tried the full invasion, that wasn't a deal at all. That was just political posturing. I know the negotiators, the US and the Russian negotiators who were in those rounds of negotiations 2 years ago. And if there was a deal to be had, they could have had it. There was no deal to be had, and the Russians aren't interested in negotiating. Why would they be? So what happens next? Again, I don't know what the real planning is, and there have been some kind of public indications of what the thinking in the Trump team might be. Things as diverse as a DMZ in Canadian, demilitarized zone, and the idea is that there'd be European troops along that demilitarized zone. Well, if Europe's not ready to put troops in now, I don't know if that's even a feasible proposal. And then the real key to that is how much territory would Ukraine have to give up? Because a sustainable peace, if those territories in the Donbass where Russia has nominal control and has had before the full-scale invasion 2 years ago, where they've had some modicum of control, those are not areas where it's a peaceable Russian reign in those occupied territories. It's quite the reverse. And so I don't see a sustainable peace coming out of that. Even if the territory to be ceded is restricted to Crimea, um, I can see Crimea has traditionally had a huge Russian military base hosted there since the late 1800s, and maybe that'll help keep the peace with the rest of Europe, but I don't see it. As for NATO ambitions, I've also seen in the media some members of the Trump team muse that part of the deal would be that Ukraine would never join NATO. Well, here's my policy problem with that. The idea that we forestall the legitimate choices of any sovereign nation to choose the alliances they keep, and that is negotiated away by other powers on the continent, kind of runs counter to the idea of sovereign equality and states being able to choose their own fate, their own freedom. That's the whole principle behind NATO. And honestly, the notion that NATO expansion caused the war in Ukraine is a piece of Putin propaganda that came fairly late in the game. It's not historically true. So all this to say, I don't know what's next. What's next is likely not good for Ukraine, and what's not good for Ukraine is not good for European security in the medium to long run.
Well, that's a great place for me to ask my next question as we kind of close out the discussion, Kerry. Um, so I'm sure our audience doesn't need a reminder about the precariousness of the globalist security environment. We've got tensions in the South China Sea, the rise of revisionist authoritarian regimes, and now to cap that all off, we have potentially an unpredictable administration in a second Trump presidency, which adds a curveball into the mix. So, with this all said, with this context, I'm wondering if you might be able to offer some reflections, Kerry, on what you consider to be the best case scenario for NATO over this next decade, and how Canada might prepare both optimistically and pessimistically for the potential outcomes given this kind of global security context.
I actually don't think that NATO's heading towards a League of Nations moment where the alliance completely crumbles. Part of that's because when multilateral organizations they gain sufficient weight over time and structure, they tend to self-perpetuate, but they will also continue to serve a need, including for the U.S. The thing that's behind kind of Trump's ideology on NATO is that NATO still has bipartisan support in the U.S. So I think the notion that NATO will crumble or it'll crumble quickly it's not going to come to pass. I hope it's not going to come to pass, right? So while the multilateral furniture is still on the deck, I think other allies who care deeply about NATO, because it's in their interests, should be trying to shore it up. So inside NATO, that means things like in rapidly increasing European defense spending and European capacity to defend Europe. Here's a kind of caveat for Canada. The very beginning of NATO and all the way through, we opposed a European pillar inside NATO because we've always seen it right from the beginning when we were negotiating the treaty as the bridge between North America and Europe and the creation of a transatlantic community. So as Europe starts to do more inside NATO, I think it's really important for Canada to think through its relationship with Europe on the security and defense front. We've started doing more with Europe as Europe through what are called PESCO projects, but it's a bit haphazard. It's not in deep. Not that PESCO is the vehicle to do this kind of Canada-EU cooperation, but my point is that we need to think through our defense relations with Europe and understand that it's in our interest um, to keep that transatlantic bridge and that transatlantic community as alive as we can manage it to get through the Trump presidency.
Well, Kerry, thanks so much for joining me for a great conversation. I think we've covered the waterfront here, everything from bilateral relations to NATO. With that said, I just wanted to once more give you the opportunity to provide any final thoughts or insights you might have, or if there's any important points you made that maybe you'd like to reiterate for the audience.
Well, I started off by saying why NATO's in Canada's interest, and it's not just for military reasons. It's for broader security reasons and political, international foreign policy reasons too. And it's in our direct economic and security interests to have that kind of transatlantic community be as vibrant and alive as we can. So it'll take some deft diplomacy to achieve that, diplomacy at NATO to achieve that, a lot of outreach with other security partners. And it'll take more defense contributions and much more defense spending. But all of this is in our interest. It's not just doing it because Donald Trump asks us to do it, because we have a history of not really liking to, leap when US presidents ask. It's in our own interest to do it, to make us less vulnerable to the unpredictability of President Trump and more secure with our allies at NATO, to keep NATO as solid as we can manage over the next few years.
Kerry, thanks for joining me today. We value your thought, leadership, and analysis. Thanks for helping us make sense of what we can expect in the coming months amid Trump's second administration. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email, or reach out to us on social media. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Until next time.